Elements of emissions inventory data management are the legs to the chair of your emissions inventory. So you need to track and record very carefully all the information that goes into supporting your emissions inventory estimate. When you talk to people, what their names are, their phone numbers, what websites you access, all this information needs to be recorded because that basically forms your values of how much pollution and from what is coming into your air. An emissions inventory consists of two things: the sources of air pollution, the sources that you include in your emissions inventory, and then it can also include the amount of air pollution by pollutant from each of these sources. So an example could be in your emissions inventory, you may just include a list of sources of air pollution, and you could also include estimates of pollutants. So for example, 10 tons per year of carbon monoxide, and so on for other pollutants, pollutant by pollutant. How you got those numbers is like a map, and you need a map for two reasons. One, so you can get back to the place where you're going, which is these values, and also to someone else, perhaps in 2 weeks. If somebody wants to review your emissions inventory so far, they're going to want to know, how did you arrive at this list of sources? What assumptions did you make about who is burning what in their homes? There are 3 places where you have to keep information. So think of your emissions inventory as a 3-legged stool. Your emissions inventory values are you sitting on this chair. You may need to make sure that you don't end up on the ground by keeping the legs of your stool strong. So first of all, your logbook. Write down more information than you think you will need. Who you talk to, when. Go to the dollar store, buy yourself a cheap logbook dedicated to your emissions inventory project and write everything down in it. A critical piece of information I always write down in logbooks are file names and paths. What folder did I store this in? The second place is your emissions inventory report itself. So in your report, as people read it, they're going to be asking themselves, well, how did she come up with 50 tons? That is a lot. Could that possibly be right? So you're going to want to include summary information of how you got those numbers, what assumptions you made. Did you do a survey or did you obtain values from the housing office, for example? The third place is on your computer. And generally you're going to have 2 places on your computer. You're going to have spreadsheets because you're going to have to do some unit conversions. So for every project, I've got a folder on my desktop, and your folder could be emissions inventory, and you could start to put documents in there. So for example, spreadsheets where you convert units, similar to the spreadsheet we're going to show you in this module. Then also TEISS. TEISS is actually a database. You know when it takes a minute to load files and you see those little files loading in the bar, the progress bar? Well, it's because it's loading tables. So it is a database, and it has great features for storing information that then, if you back up your TEISS project by saving that folder where you're storing your TEISS project, for example, onto a USB drive, you've backed it up, and all that information is stored in the TEISS database. So you have to use all 3 of these and think of these as the legs of your chair. So keep the legs of your chair strong by taking the time to document in all 3 places, even if it's duplicating information. The calculators have the function of printing blank forms. So when you look at a calculator and you say, yeah, this looks like it is appropriate for this source, I'm going to try to save this information so I can see what information I'm going to need to gather. You can see if you go to File and then Print Blank, you can print actually a paper copy and save it as a printer file, which you could save to your computer. Then ultimately, If you talk to people on the phone or go to a source and gather this information, or even slowly gather it yourself by doing research on the type of coal burned, etc., you could take a picture of this form after you've filled in the information in pen, save it as a PDF, email it to yourself, and store it in a folder called Scanned Data Collection Sheets, for example. So be creative in your data management and don't be afraid of duplicating information. It's great to have the original paper copies in a file and then a computer file where you've got the information showing your handwritten notes as a photograph. Why do we do data management? Again, you'll need it to prove the quality of your emissions estimates. Are these just based upon assumptions that you made, or are they really based upon actually going out and gathering up-to-date throughput information? It's a huge help when you update your emissions inventory. So again, emissions inventories are really a cornerstone of your AIR program, and in 3 years or in 5 years, it might be you updating this emissions inventory to include new sources that you have, and it is great. It will save you days of time that you're having to spend now figuring this out. But if you keep adequate notes, you'll be able to go back and say, oh, okay, that's how I did that. ITEP reviewed it. Let me look. By that time, TEISS will be updated with new emission factors. So you may have to do the calculations again, but you will see what you did before, and it will help you step through the process. So you start with the data that you collect, and that, for our example, is wood burned for residential heating. So the number of cords burned by the people in your community to stay warm. Also, and you will find this out if you print the blank calculator, it's not just the number of cords of wood, it's the types of stoves, right? Because the older stoves don't have any provisions for burning the wood at a higher temperature, but the newer stoves with the catalytic devices burn the wood at a higher temperature, and therefore less is emitted into the air. Then you've got the tools that TEISS has, and TEISS has the up-to-date emission factors with all the references for where these emission factors come from that you need to put in your emissions inventory report, and the calculators, which are simply equations that puts the numbers together combined with your throughput information to give you the results, for example, of 50 tons of PM10. So the question that you need to document in your data management is, how did you estimate the number of cords burned for residential heating? So it's important that you document this, because when somebody's looking over your emissions inventory, they will want to know whether you did this quick and dirty estimate or you actually went out and gathered up-to-date site-specific activity data. Also required in your record keeping is what equations you used. Of course, TEISS has these calculators for you, but the equations all look pretty similar, and they're based upon the emission rate equals the emission factor, and that's pollutant specific, and that is provided by TEISS. Then you have to put in these values here, the activity data, and these values you need to buttress or support with lots of information about how you got these estimates. So the volume of wood burned, for example, for one home, H would be the number of households, and that could be obtained, for example, from the housing department. The percent is the percent of houses heating with wood, because some people might heat with propane. And then D, the dry density of wood. All this is factored into the TEISS calculator, but it needs this information from you. So for each variable, that's each piece of information that you have to enter into TEISS, you have to make sure that in the three places, so the three legs of your chair, you document in your logbook, in the TEISS project, in the QA/QC tabs that will demonstrate, and in your emissions inventory report, just in summary information, you need to state, for example, that the emission factors are from EPA AP 42 5th edition, And you can read about these calculators and obtain the reference for where the emission factor is from that's used in the TEISS calculator on those opening screens of the TEISS calculators with the hyperlinks to EPA websites and other websites where you can read information to find how they got these emission factors, just at least to the extent that you have this reference to include in your emissions inventory report. Then these other values you can just state in your notes and also in the TEISS QA/QC tabs that you obtained this information from the Tribal Housing Office. You would want to put in your notes and in TEISS the name of the person you spoke with. Ideally, you would get a copy of the report that they're looking up to tell you these numbers. The dry density of wood, there is a link in the information page where you access the TEISS calculator that gives you a link to a table to look up this information. So you would want to include that URL, that website address, in your notes, and you could just copy it into the TEISS project QA/QC tabs, for example, and you could even include a long list of references in your emissions inventory report if you wanted to provide that level of documentation, for example, in a references section or in an appendix. So the data management report example is in your folder, and it shows an example of how to present data in an emissions inventory report. So this is just an example of the level of detail that you would provide in your emissions inventory. So this emissions inventory data management report example, again, is something that could be part of your emission inventory report, and it's specific to residential wood stoves, just showing the level of detail that you might want to consider in your emissions inventory report. Keep in mind what, how, where, when, and from whom. Those are the things that you need to document. So for example, the what is emissions of these pollutants from wood-burning stoves and fireplaces were estimated for emission inventory area. And then how, referencing where the emission factors came from, and you can get this information from TEISS. And then it references Appendix A, which is just the second page of this two-pager, where it says the formula used is provided in Appendix A, and then how you got these numbers. So where you got the numbers, when you got them, and from whom. How many surveys were sent out, when the survey was conducted. You could include a copy of the survey form as an appendix and a summary of the data. And then obviously the completed survey forms, you're going to want to keep those hard copies and again perhaps scan them or take pictures of them with your phone and save them as PDFs and email them to yourself and store them in a folder. And the calculations for the amount of wood burned is tricky because there's two things that have to be factored in. First, people buy wood in cords, but you need to know the volume of a cord. Well, the volume of a cord is 79 cubic feet. So that's the first calculation, and the next demonstration will show you this calculation in Excel. Then once you've got the number of cubic feet of wood, then you need to make sure that you know what kind of wood. So for example, Rocky Mountain hardwood is really heavy and weighs 24 pounds per cubic foot. Now it may be that the wood burned in your area is lighter or even more heavy. And then once you get the number of pounds of wood burned, then you can divide by 2,000 to get tons, and that's what you need to enter into the TEISS calculator. Then you might have just a table where you obtain your values from the TEISS calculator and put them into a summary table. And then you may have an appendix, and you may want to have such specific information from all of your sources where you give the reference, you write out the equation, and again this is in TEISS, and then you provide references, especially for example to the type of wood you use and how much it weighs. Finally, you may want to include the actual emission factors for each pollutant, where you provide the units of the emission factors, the pounds of pollutant emitted per tons of wood burned, and you can see that it varies depending upon what sort of wood stove people have. Next, we're going to demonstrate a spreadsheet where Angelique shows you how to calculate the tons of wood burned as an input into the TEISS calculator.